guys, I'm going to show you how to make the simplest pattern for making a doll or stuffed animal that you possibly can. This is a super basic doll body shape that I used for making a ninja, but you can use it for making any kind of doll that you want. And I'm going to show you my process for doing this because you can absolutely do this yourself. I'm using a piece of scrap paper. You don't have to have super drawing skills. I am folding in half. And I'm going to draw the rough shape of half of a doll. You don't have to have skills. I'm going to be scribbly here. Do kind of a half circle for a head. Just think of a gingerbread man shape. Do a little arm. Do a little foot. Now I'm going to cut this out while still folded. There you go. I'll unfold that and I now have a perfect little person shape. It really did not take much of any drawing talent. If you end up with a little point on the top of your head because your circle's not perfect, that's easy to fix. Just give it a little snip and round it out. And now you have your own pattern to use. You can use this for any kind of a doll you want. You can add ears to make it a bear or a bunny, or you can use this same method of making pretty much any shape you want. When we make the doll, we're just gonna cut out one piece for the front, another piece for the back, and sew them together. This is very much like a pillow. So that is what we're going to use for my first project that I hope to show you later, where I'll show you how I make one of my ninjas. The only other piece I'm going to need to make this pattern is this eye shape or this face cutout for my ninja. You can skip that if you're not making a ninja, but if you want to follow my next video and make a ninja, we're going to have one more piece of fabric to cut out of felt or fleece for the part of the skin that is showing through their ninja mask. So if we go back to our pattern here, we can also mark that out with our pencil and just make ourselves a little ovally shape that their eye is going to peek out through, and cut that out. Now we have a pattern piece to use to cut out the face, and now our pattern looks a bit like an astronaut. Now I'm going to show you how to cut out your fabric. I'm going to use this piece of fleece and I'm going to line up my pattern so that the stretchier direction of the fabric is going from left to right across my doll's body, not up and down. So my doll will actually be a little plumper when it's stuffed and it stretches, not extra tall and skinny if I flopped it the other way. I'm going to fold over my fabric, and this fabric looks the same on both sides, but you'll want to make sure that what you want to show on the outside of your doll, or the right side of the fabric, is folded to the inside when you are marking and cutting your pattern. So these marks I'm making with my chalk pencil are going to be what would be the inside of the doll, the side that will not show. You don't have to use a chalk pencil. Just make sure that whatever you're marking your fabric with is something that's not going to bleed through to the other side of the fabric and be visible when you are finished with your doll. Right now I'm going to pop a few pins into this fabric so that when I cut it out, my two pieces of fabric will not slide around. This is a great big piece of fabric, so to make it easier on myself, I am rough cutting around the outside of my doll so that I only have to work with this small piece of fabric as I am trying to cut it out. Now I'm going to cut around those lines I made, but I'm going to leave some space called a seam allowance. So I'm not going to cut right on the lines. I'm leaving at least a 1/4 inch around the outside of those lines I made for my seam allowance. You might also find it helpful to make some other marks on your fabric before you start cutting. You'll need to leave a gap in your stitches so that you can turn this right side out after you've stitched most of it. I've made a mark of that on my pattern, and I'm going to mark it on my fabric just so I don't forget, because I have actually several times sewn the whole thing closed and had to redo it. I'm also going to make a little mark here for the placement of the eyes for my finished ninja. You don't have to do this, but sometimes it can be helpful to make some other marks on your fabric before you start sewing. I'm also going to cut out a piece of felt in whatever color I want my ninja skin to be. And this step is where I'm going to line it up where I want it. And I'm going to go ahead and poke a hole for the safety eyes that I'm using before I even start sewing it. So I'm using one and only one layer of the black fabric. I have set the eye opening, the tan piece here where I want it to be. And I'm actually going to stab through there with this pair of sharp scissors or whatever you have handy that'll stab through. You only need to do this step if you're using the plastic safety eyes. Now that I have those holes poked all the way through my fabric, I'm going to just barely make those holes slightly larger so that the posts for my safety eyes will fit through. I'm going to put them through my top layer of felt and then through my one layer of the fleece, and I'm going to use the plastic backing to slide on that until it's tight up against the back of the fabric. Now I'm going to take that piece of fabric that I have added my safety eyes to, and I'm going to line it back up with the other piece of fabric. Remember that the right side, the side I want to see on the finished doll, is on the inside of this stack of fabric. And now I'm going to pin it back together to get ready to do my sewing. I'm going to show you the absolute basics of how to get started on hand sewing. I've done a couple videos showing you how to get started on our Ninja project, and I'm not going to show you on the actual Ninja project because it is really hard to see black thread on black fabric, and you would typically want to have thread that matches your fabric. In this case, I'm going to use black thread on this neon orange fabric so you'll be able to see what I'm doing. The hard part is getting the needle threaded. There are things you can buy called a needle threader. I don't use those. So you have to just get the thread through the eye of your needle. Sometimes I find it easier to do if I fold it in half over my needle and I have kind of a little loop there and I shove that through the needle, because sometimes the edge of your thread gets a little frayed and it can be hard to get in your needle. I usually sew with a single piece of thread, but when you do that, you have to hold on to it so your needle doesn't throw off, and that can be harder for a beginner. So I would recommend doubling over your thread and tying a little knot in it at the very end. So I've got the two edges of my thread here, and I'm going to tie a little knot in that. In fact, I'm going to tie 2 knots to try and make that knot a little bit thicker. So now I've got my knot on the end of my thread with my needle. I have on my fabric here, I have 2 layers of fabric I'm going to sew together. I've marked this horribly crooked line with a chalk pencil, just like we marked our Ninja pattern with a pencil where we wanted our sewing line to be. And if you're sewing in your Ninja, you're going to be doing the same thing. You're going to sew along the line we marked. And I'm going to start by putting my thread through the fabric on that line. My little knot's going to catch, but I'm not going to trust it. It might go all the way through. So I'm going to just barely put my needle into the fabric a little bit and pull my needle through until I have a loop. I'm not going to pull it all the way through. I'm going to put my needle through that loop, creating a knot that's attached to the fabric. That's going to anchor it so that little knot's going to slide, not going to slide through if I pull my needle. And I'm going to basically just go up and down on my line. So I went up, this time I'm going to go down, and I'm going to pull my thread all the way through. Then I'm going to try and put my needle back up right next to where that stitch was on my line. So up and then down. So you're going to want to keep your stitches as close as you can. Stitching on fleece can be a little difficult because it is very thick, so you have to have a little patience. So that's it. We're just going to go back and forth, up and down on our fabric. That was a really, really crooked stitch there. I'm holding this at a very awkward angle to keep it under the camera. So please forgive this horrible stitching. So I'm only gonna make a couple more stitches. When I'm gonna finish off my line of stitching, I need to make another knot. So I'm going to again put my needle into the fabric, catch a little fabric on my needle, pull it until I have a loop, put my needle through that loop and make a knot. I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to make 2 knots. I'm going to put my needle through a little bit. All right, now I've made my knot. Please forgive this knot. It is a little messy, but it's not going to show because it's on the inside of my fabric. And then I'm just going to trim it off close to where I made that knot. Here's my ninja I'm working on. I've stitched it starting here on the leg all the way around, finishing back up on that same leg, but not stitching it all the way up. I have a gap right here so that I can turn this and then stuff it. But before I do that, it's really important for me to clip my corners. Wherever I have an inside curve like this around the arms, the legs, and the neck, you need to snip your seam allowance as close to your stitches as you can. You have to be very careful not to snip through your stitches or you're going to have to restitch it. That's why I like a nice tiny sharp pair of scissors like this. You can get special sewing scissors for this. These are nail clippers. They had them at Walmart for super cheap and they work. So I'm going to snip this right here in this corner as close as I can to my stitching without cutting the thread. That's really important. So now I have this little notch. And the reason I have to do this is when I turn this right side out, if I don't trim this extra little bit of the seam allowance close, the fabric's gonna pucker up really weird there in those corners because it won't stretch. Another thing you need to do on some projects is to clip around your outside curves, because once I turn this inside out, that extra fabric along the seam allowance gets crowded all together. So in some cases, it's a good idea to take, if you have a pair of pinking shears, this is a pair of pinking shears. These have a zigzag edge on them. These are really handy to use if you need to clip around some really small curves. A big curve like this and a thick fabric doesn't usually give me too much issues, but when I'm making small heads, small round heads for some of my dolls that are made of finer, thinner fabrics, I do find they tend to want to pucker around their chins. So what you would do with that, I don't need to do it with this fleece. I've never had a problem with my fleece. But if you're working with thinner fabric and small little curves, you can take your pinking shears and snip off some of the excess fabric, being very careful not to cut your stitches as close as you can. If I don't have pinking shears, I can just do some little snips by hand. I'm going to go snip, 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 snip. So when I turn that fabric around, all this extra fabric that now tries to fit inside this tiny curve has some room to kind of overlap each other and not bunch up. Again, with this project here, I don't have to worry about that. Next, what I have to do is turn this guy right side out. I can do that by hand in some cases, but it can be hard if you've got little details to turn to do that by hand. Let's say I can turn this, but I just can't get the little details like the arms to turn right side out. So I'm going to grab a part that's farthest away from the end. And I'm going to try and pull this thing through that hole right side out. This can be a little challenging because now it might be hard to get my arms and legs and smaller details out. I can put my finger in there and try and push that leg out, but if that's giving me an issue, I can use easy household tools. This is a chopstick. You could use a knitting needle. You could even use the end of a pencil. Whatever you have on hand, you just don't want the end to be really sharp because you don't want to poke through your fabric. You can use that to poke out those little details like the arms and the legs. And then I'm also going to run that around the inside of the head here to make the head all the way puffed out. So now I've got my right side out body, but still with this gap here in the leg. And I need to leave that gap until after it's done stuffing because I need somewhere to put the stuffing. So now I'm going to start stuffing it. And I'm going to show you two different types. This is your typical polyester stuffing. It comes in big clumps like this that kind of looks like clouds. This is what I use for a lot of my project, and it's what you're going to find in most craft stores. This kind of stuffing is cluster stuffing. A couple of different brands make it. You'll usually see the word cluster in the name. It's in these tiny little itty bitty clusters, and you can make a much softer stuffed animal with this without worrying about it being lumpy like it would look if you're using standard stuffing and don't fill it really full. Since this is a beginner project, I'm going to use the standard polyester stuffing that you can find at most craft stores. And it's a little easier to work with because the cluster stuffing can be very messy and hard to work with when you're trying to work it into this little opening that we left for the stuffing. When you're using just regular polyester stuffing, you'll want to put your stuffing into that slot that we left and start by pushing it into the areas that are farthest away from your opening, like the head here. Now, the head is a large area, so I'm going to want to use larger chunks of stuffing. You actually want to try and grab clumps of stuffing that are about the size of the area you're trying to fill, and you never ever want to ball it up really tight before you put it in your stuffed animal. You want it nice and loose, just like I have here, and you're going to push it in, and then you'll pack it in tightly once you have it in the stuffed animal to fill up the space completely. And when you're using this kind of stuffing, you do need to stuff it very firmly. Otherwise, it is going to come out very lumpy. So I'm just going to keep adding stuffing. You're going to use more than you think you will. It'll take a good amount of stuffing for a small stuffed animal like this. As you can see, I've already put in several handfuls and I'm still just filling up the head. And I want to make sure that in the neck area is nice and full too, because it's easy sometimes to fill the extremities like the head and the arms and not really make sure that the neck and the shoulders and those kind of transitional areas are nice and full so that it doesn't end up floppy. You might end up wanting to get out that tool that we used earlier when we were turning our fabric right side out, because that can help you get the stuffing into those little skinny areas like the arms. And again, I'm going to put that in there and try and pack it pretty tight once I have it in the area where I want the stuffing to be until it feels like those arms are stuffed pretty firmly. The last thing to stuff is that leg where we left that opening. And that might get a little challenging. So I'm going to stuff it as best I can until I have it as full as I can get it without the stuffing all spilling right back out. But I might need to stuff it as best I can and then sew the opening at least part way closed so I can finish filling this leg up all the way. The stitch I'm going to do here is a little bit different than a running stitch that we used for the rest of the stuffed animal. We're going to use a ladder stitch. The ladder stitch is where the needle is going to go in and out on the same side of the fabric and then go across the opening and go in and out on that side. I'll try and show you the best I can here. I'm mostly self-taught, so I might not be the best at teaching you techniques for sewing. If you look up the ladder stitch, you can probably find better videos, but I'll try and show you here. So I'm not on the very, very edge of the fabric. I'm close to the edge of the fabric, and I'm going in and out, and then across that opening, in and out, and then back and forth. So you're going to have strings going back and forth across that opening that look a bit like a ladder. But once I've done that, I can pull it tight and it'll pull those two halves together. So you can see that little ladder look right there. And I'm going to pull it tight. Once I have this opening about halfway stitched together, continuing that ladder stitch, I'm going to pull it tight and tie a knot in it anchored to the fabric just like we did when we finished our running stitch earlier. Now that I've stitched that opening up about halfway, I'm going to continue adding stuffing into that little bitty hole that I have left. And it might fight me a little bit at this point, but I'm going to keep stuffing until it is all the way full. Then I will continue my ladder stitches until I have completely sewn up that opening. And again, I'm going to knot it secured to the fabric just like we did our finishing knot earlier. Once you're all done, if you notice a spot like this where you can see there's a gap in my stitching, don't worry, you can just use that same ladder stitch that we just used to close the final opening in the leg to fix any areas like that. It can be easy to have a spot like this, especially in the corners of the fabric like that armpit, where you might not have your stitches quite close enough and you end up with a little gap. But it happens to the best of us, and it's easily fixed with that ladder stitch. Here I am finishing up that opening with a knot where I'm making sure it is secured to the fabric like I'd done before. You might notice before you do this step that you have little bits of fiber wanting to stick out that gap. Don't worry about it. Just pull them out, trim them off. It's not a big deal. Now you notice here I pushed my needle partway into the doll and then out through another part of the body and then trimmed off my thread. That way the end of my thread is tucked inside the stuffed animal and not poking out the side. Now that it's finished, I'm just kind of squishing things into shape in places where it might seem a little lumpy. You can kind of work on that just like fluffing a pillow. If you've been following my videos so far, you would have already put the safety eyes into your fabric like I have here, but we haven't sewn the edges of this tan skin colored fabric down. So I'm going to start doing that now. If you aren't using safety eyes, just go ahead and layer your skin toned fabric onto the ninja's body at this point and start stitching around the edge just like I am here. This is a little bit of a different stitch of what I used before. I'm starting off by making a knot, just like I did with my other hand sewing. And I'm going to bring my needle down just past the edge of that skin tone fabric and then back up just inside the edge of that skin tone fabric. So I'm making little bitty tiny stitches that go over the edge. It's important to pick a thread that matches your skin color and try and keep your stitches as tiny as possible. Next, we're going to make a headband by cutting a long skinny piece out of felt or fleece. I'm going to wrap that around his head and tie it in a little knot at the back. You can also tie the headband on the side if you want. If I don't want my headband to come off, I can put a couple stitches in it to keep it on. I'm not going to sew it all the way around. I'm just going to make a couple little stitches right here where the headband meets the seam on the side of its head. I'm just going to make about 2 stitches and then a couple knots to keep it on. I'm also going to do a couple of stitches in the very back where the knot is. This version is not knotted, if you'll notice. In this version of the headband, I just wrapped it around and put a couple stitches to sew the 2 sides of the headband together. That's it for our basic ninja. If you didn't use safety eyes, you can use buttons, embroidery, anything you want. Even be a little silly like this version with googly eyes. But you don't have to stop there. You can come up with your own versions, different headbands, different hats. Do something creative like an alien or a super ninja, or something a little more creative for the holidays like a Santa Claus ninja. Come up with your own ideas. And I hope you have fun with this. Thank you so much for joining me for my video on how to make a very basic stuffed doll. I hope you join me again. Bye.